I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, as the costs of the pandemic pile up, Zambia defaults on its debts as China and private investors wrangle over who should take losses on their loans. And the debt tsunami means that central banks are considering the unthinkable, negative interest rates. But are investors prepared to pay governments for the privilege of lending to them? And Brazil is no longer one of the world's top 10 economies. Many Brazilians face a painful financial future with soaring food prices and house prices. The G20 Rich Countries Club struck an historic agreement on restructuring debt for some of the world's poorest nations. The move goes beyond the current deal to freeze debt repayments until June next year and is significant because it includes China. Beijing has been reluctant to sign up to any deal that would cancel or restructure debts. Well, China accounts for 63% of overall debt owed to G20 nations in 2019. It's not known exactly how much money China is owed, but various estimates say the country has given out loans worth $1 trillion to $5 trillion in the past 20 years. And that's a problem. The United States and many Western private lenders have been unwilling to discuss restructuring debt for the poorest nations because they don't want to bail out Beijing. China's gone as far as classifying state lenders as private institutions to avoid scrutiny. Most of the money has been spent on rolling out its Belt and Road Initiative to build infrastructure and increase its influence in mostly developing nations. Its largesse has come at huge cost for many of the 138 nations that have signed up to the program. Now, despite that historic G20 deal, a number of countries are close to defaulting on their debts as the pandemic decimates economies. Zambia became the first African defaulter of the COVID-19 era. It has the backing of many anti-debt campaigners who are encouraging more nations to join Zambia in threatening default. Zambia's problems predate the pandemic. It's Africa's second biggest copper exporter, and as copper prices tanked, it found it more difficult to meet its payments. It's thought the country has $11 billion worth of debt. Negotiations have hit a wall because of debts it owes to China. It's thought that Zambia owes China about $3 billion, but China won't offer debt relief unless it gets $200 million in arrears paid first. Private lenders aren't willing to give Zambia new money for fear that it'll be used to pay off China. And not without good reason. Zambia has said it may draw down $700 million worth of Chinese debt. Zambia has also been in talks with the International Monetary Fund for a $1.3 billion loan. Let's get more on what could be a gathering storm if more countries default on their debts. From London via Skype, we're joined by Elisa Strobel, Senior Economist for Sub-Saharan Africa at IHS Markit. Elisa, good to have you with us. How on earth did Zambia get into such a financial mess?
Yes, economic mismanagement and the lack of fiscal consolidation over recent years underlines Zambia's financial difficulty. Additionally, inadequate transparency over debt owed to Chinese lenders, including alleged off-balance sheet Chinese loans to state-owned enterprises to Zambia, and the fact that Zambia favors debt restructuring over IMF engagement add to the dilemma. The Zambian authorities have been unwilling to secure an IMF support program since late 2017 that would unlock more concessional financing, leaving total external debt therefore to increase sharply and also inhibiting the government's ability to agree on short-term fiscal and balance of payments funding from other multilateral institutions such as the African Development Bank.
What has Zambia been doing with the money that it's borrowed? There are allegations that the government might have been spending it on winning elections rather than helping the economy.
Yes. Well, some parts of the borrowed money went into recurrent expenditure, including salaries, while other parts went into infrastructure projects, including the Lusaka-Ndola $1.2 billion road project. However, there were concerns raised over allegations of artificially pushed price inflation in some of the infrastructure projects, as mentioned, the Lusaka-Ndola road project. Also, there are various corruption allegations that support the rhetoric of mismanagement of funds. As a result, in September 2018, some donor foreigners have suspended their donor aid support for the Zambian government budget, hereby in particular the financing of the cash transfer programs as well as the agricultural sector were particularly negatively impacted by these suspensions.
And is that why China is reluctant to offer any debt relief?
Well, China mainland state-backed lenders are very unlikely to pursue full-scale debt relief and opt for debt restructuring instead. This is because debt forgiveness can set an undesirable example to other debtors to seek more favorable treatment on Chinese loans, especially as this will be politically currently difficult to justify given China mainland's economy beginning to recover from the impact of the COVID-19 virus outbreak. Instead, China mainland is likely to provide debt relief on a case-by-case basis, which may include, for instance, extending the payment period, temporary waiving off interest payments if lending is not already on concessional terms, offering further credit to avoid default, or marginally forgiving debt by either reducing project scope or debt-to-equity agreements for some of the commodity-rich countries in particular, like Angola.
You mentioned Angola. Are there any other countries in a similar situation to Zambia? How many more Zambias are there out there?
Yes, we see for a variety of countries next year to see the debt service burden to build up sharply, such as for South Africa, Namibia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Kenya's government's refusal to access relief under the G20 debt service suspension initiative heightens fiscal risks beyond the receiving of the emergency COVID-19 funding. For the majority of African countries, however, debt initiatives by the G20 and the IMF, we currently have around 34 countries, African countries, that have received emergency funding by the IMF. These packages have eased external liquidity pressures somewhat, and the extension of these initiatives lowers non-payment risk somewhat currently until mid-next year.
Are there concerns that Zambia could be heading the same way as Zimbabwe? Yes, because we do not see any near-term improvement in this regard. Zambian authorities will have to prove to private lenders as well as the IMF that government debt will be placed on a more sustainable path and show policy credibility in order to unlock emergency funding that is so necessary. However, because of the upcoming elections next year that would involve higher spending, we expect IMF engagement as rather unlikely prior to that. Also, the IMF warned that Zambia's replacement of its central bank governor last August led to an increase in political control over monetary policy, resulting in a weakening of Zambia's policy credibility and thus delaying discussions with the IMF further. Elisa, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
The coronavirus pandemic has ravaged Brazil's economy, which is predicted to contract by about 5% this year. Economic analysis shows the South American nation is no longer ranked among the world's top 10 economies. Many Brazilians face a painful financial future with soaring food and house prices. Al Jazeera's Monica Yanikiev reports now from Rio.
It's tea time in this slum in Rio de Janeiro. Baker sounds his horn to announce fresh buns for sale, but they cost 50% more than in January.
Food prices in general have become absurdly expensive since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. Unemployment is at a 14% record high, and many here are surviving on the government emergency aid, which will only last until the end of the year.
For Brazil's poor, the future looks bleak, but investors are also worried. The country is no longer part of the world's top 10 economies. Brazilians used to boast the 9th largest GDP. Now they rank 12 on the list, according to a report based on data from the International Monetary Fund.
Brazil's productivity has been declining since 2015. With the pandemic, the economy will shrink an additional 5%. Besides that, political uncertainty has helped devalue the Brazilian real, making it one of the world's worst performing currencies this year.
A weak currency favors exports, but the silver lining is a double-edged sword. With less food being sold on the domestic market, prices have gone up. Most Brazilians, like Angelina Pedrosa, are not interested in the country's international ranking. They're worried that staple foods like rice and black beans are 20% more expensive.
It's not only food prices that went up, construction material is also more expensive. These rigs, for example, cost 30% more than before the pandemic.
Luis Pereira da Silva lost his job as a truck driver and moved his belongings from an apartment in a poor neighborhood to a shack.
This is my palace. At least I have a roof over my head and a small vegetable garden.
Economy Minister Paulo Guedes says Brazil will grow once the pandemic is over and he can finally implement market-friendly reforms. But for most here, what matters now is putting food on the table. The economic recovery promised by the government still sounds like a long, hard, uphill battle. Monica Yanakiev, Al Jazeera, Rio de Janeiro.
Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. After the financial crisis in 2008, central banks poured trillions of dollars into buying up government debt to make sure the cost of borrowing didn't get out of hand. Quantitative easing also helped to grease the financial infrastructure, making sure that banks could continue to loan money to businesses. Central banks are very much at the limit of what they can do to keep economies motoring, but there is a new tool that has and is about to be deployed. Negative interest rates. Simply put, that would mean investors would pay the government to hold bonds. Consumers may have to pay banks to hold their money, and borrowers pay less back on the mortgages that they have. The Bank of England, which has set rates at 0.1%, could be the next to introduce negative rates. OK, let's bring in our regular contributor, Bilal Hafiz, Chief Executive of the Macro Hive. Bilal, what are negative interest rates and what's got us to the point that we're thinking about using such unconventional tools?
No, that's a very good question. I mean, negative rates really does sound like we're in some kind of fantasy world. That's essentially where when somebody takes out a loan, rather than paying interest, they receive interest. And so this is something central banks have started to engage in over the last 4 or 5 years.
Why, as an investor, would I pay a bank for their debt? And why, as a saver, would I pay a bank to hold it?
No, that's a very good question, and I think there's a few answers to that question. You know, one is there's still a convenience factor whereby the alternative is to hold your money in cash, which would then require you to store the money in your house or under the mattress or in a safe or something like that. And this is not just for individuals, but this also applies to companies as well. Companies would have to store all of their cash in a physical location, and that would be quite onerous, and that there will be a cost associated with that. So the thinking is that there's a level of interest that somebody would be willing to pay for a bank to hold their money. And so in that way, there is some scope for negative rates simply to be a charge for holding your money. Now, if the negative rates are too negative, then there would be much more of a move for people to store cash themselves physically in some way. But at the moment, the rates, while they are negative, they aren't sufficiently negative for people to make that switch.
They have been used before, in Sweden in particular. Has it helped economies where it's been used?
The trouble here is that many of the countries that did introduce negative rates, like Sweden and the Eurozone, they also introduced lots of other measures at the same time as well. So, for example, these countries engaged in quantitative easing, which meant that the governments also started to buy government bonds, which pushed down long-term interest rates in those countries and pushed down mortgage rates in those countries. So at one level, it's hard to disentangle the two. In general, what you can say is that after these countries did introduce negative rates, you did see these economies start to improve economically. Their growth did pick up. However, inflation, which is the thing that the central banks really wanted to increase, didn't really increase that much at all. So it does seem like after 3-4 years of central banks doing this, there is some reluctance to push this too much further. It seems like most central banks now have decided not to really go down the route of pushing rates even more negative.
What about wealth inequality? Does it encourage households to take on more debt that they can't afford?
Yeah, there is a real possibility that could happen. There are a couple of different sort of issues here. One is that if you do have negative rates, people are more reluctant to put their money into savings accounts. So instead, they may start to save in more risky investments. So they may go into equities or high-yielding corporate bonds. So there is that possibility. But then the other side is also that, are these negative rates passed on to households for them to be able to borrow at negative rates themselves? And that's less clear. What we have seen is that the negative rates and also the quantitative easing have pushed down interest rates in general, which has then allowed people to get, say, for example, lower mortgage rates. And through lower mortgage rates, people have been buying houses a lot more. So in that sense, there has been this increase in asset prices. And not everybody owns a house. It tends to be richer people that own houses and are able to buy equities. And so you are seeing there is this inequality that has been building since we have seen the introduction of negative rates.
Bilal, I'm going to completely change the subject now. A massive trading bloc is coming into force, covering a third of the world's population and a third of the world's economy. Do you think that the US is going to counter China's influence in this new trade pact with its own trans-Pacific trading pact?
I think they will. I mean, it's been quite evident that, under the Trump administration, the US started to withdraw from various multilateral agreements, with Asia, with Europe, and so on. And this allowed China and other Asian countries to form their own trading blocs. And so they had their own version of TPP, and more recently now the RCEP, which has China in that trading bloc. So what you've seen is as the US has withdrawn from the world, from these multilateral organizations, the rest of the world has started to form their own trading blocs. Now, this will be an issue for the US. The US does have a new administration, well, so it seems at least, with President Biden. And the noise we're getting from the US side is that they are very much motivated to re-engage in multilateral agreements. So my sense is they will try to enter some kind of or some new version of TPP with Asian countries. The challenge for them is that these agreements in Asia have already started to be formed, with this new China trade agreement. So the challenge for the US will be to somehow enter into this stage where all these agreements have already started to be formed. So it will be a bit of a challenge for the US, but I do think they will try to launch their own Asia-US trade agreement.
Bilal, it's always good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Now, climate change and overfishing are endangering many species in the rich waters around Antarctica. The major threats are top priority at a conference in Chile, where scientists are pushing for a protected marine park around the Antarctic Peninsula. Our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, reports from Santiago.
The waters around the Antarctic Peninsula are not only home to unique marine animals, but also to their means of survival. They eat krill, a key species in the Southern Ocean's ecosystem. But all this is in danger of extinction because of overfishing around the Antarctic Peninsula, which is why the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Resources is being asked to approve a proposal for the creation of a marine protected area around the peninsula.
The science has been showing that Antarctica is particularly delicate, but also very important for the whole world.
Why do you say that the Antarctica is so important for the rest of the world?
This current called the Humboldt Current is actually a current that comes from the Antarctica, and it brings all this cold, rich water on microorganisms, but also very rich in oxygen because it's cold. So the current also creates a huge amount of life for a much bigger area than just Antarctica. The only way to actually have more fish even in the future, or to have life in this planet, is actually to protect some of those places that are key for the balance of this planet.
For the third year in a row, Chile and Argentina are jointly asking the annual meeting of the Commission to declare parts of the peninsula off limits to commercial fishing. The Southern Ocean's unique environment supports species that can't be found anywhere else on the planet.
So the idea is to manage in a different way the fishery and the activities that are occurring in the area by designing this MPA that includes some areas commonly called non-take zones, where the fishery will not be allowed.
But there's resistance, particularly from Russia and China. Argentina says there's no time to lose.
Argentina and Chile have taken the initiative because if something is not done soon, it will be all of humanity that will be damaged. We ask the countries that are considering vetoing this proposal not to do so because we need this. Humanity needs this.
His plea for the rational use of marine resources is backed by all the best available science, which in the past has been the guiding light for the 26 Commission members. But for some countries, that may not be enough. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Santiago.
Al Jazeera has obtained recordings of one of the world's most wanted men trying to negotiate immunity from prosecution. The billionaire financier Joe Low is wanted for his role in Malaysia's multi-billion-dollar 1MDB fraud scandal. Marianne Jolly has our exclusive report. Just a warning, it contains some flashing lights.
He was once notorious for his decadent lifestyle, luxury real estate and super yacht, all bought with 1MDB money. But today the Malaysian financier Joe Low is on the run, wanted by authorities in the United States and Malaysia.
I've gone from...
In recordings obtained exclusively by Al Jazeera, Joe Low is heard for the first time trying to cut a deal with Mahathir Mohamed's government soon after its historic election win in May 2018.
As far as I'm concerned, I just want to do whatever it takes to sort of move on.
On the phone, Joe Low protests his innocence, but offers to return all the assets purchased with 1MDB funds.
And then in return, basically, I would need Malaysia's undertaking that, this is settled and there will be no future proceedings against me and so on and so forth.
I think he's delusional. Former FBI special agent Deborah LaPrevotte worked on the agency's initial 1MDB investigation.
It's like the bank robber who gets caught and he's like, well, if I return the money, then I don't want to be charged with robbing the bank. Well, you still robbed the bank, and in this case, you robbed the development fund.
And there's strong evidence he did, according to the man who led the FBI's 1MDB investigation until recently.
I think we're very confident that we will be able to prove Joe Low's involvement and his position in this scheme.
In July this year, Joe Low's co-conspirator, Malaysia's former Prime Minister Najib Razak, was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in jail, subject to an appeal for crimes related to 1MDB. Back in 2018, Joe Low put all the blame on Najib.
Whatever they want to say, but ultimately I have no authority to make any decision.
But bringing the fugitive to justice has proved challenging. Despite 2 Interpol red notices against him and multiple passports cancelled, he continues to evade authorities and travel.
The only way that can happen is through corruption and through the full resources of one or more governments.
But according to the fugitive, life on the run is not easy.
It's quite stressful, because, we can't pay our legal fees. It's racking up and, we don't want this issue to drag on.
2 years on, and he's still paying millions of dollars to lawyers and PR firms around the world. Marianne Jolly, Al Jazeera.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, you can get in touch with us. Tweet me, I'm at @afinnegan on Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Drop us a line. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you can catch up on past shows. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.